That was good, wasn't it? Now, different subject. Indonesia is supposed to be an example of a more moderate Islamic state. Well, it produces terrorism. Christians are often persecuted. Just recently, farmers were beheaded and kids arrested and abused. Well, who better to discuss the reality of this than the founder of Jihad Watch, author, great man, Robert Spencer. He joins me now from somewhere in the US. I've said this before, we can't be too specific because you are threatened on a regular basis. Robert, in Indonesia, we don't hear too much about, but rather like Malaysia, we assume it's more pluralistic than the rest of the Islamic world. Is that true?
No, it's not in the least true, but it's a very common myth. And a lot of it comes from some of the political currents that have been popular in Indonesia, but are now receding, just as they are all over the Middle East and North Africa. What we see in Indonesia is the same thing we see there, the rise of Islamic supremacist pro-Sharia groups that are terrorizing the Christians, and other non-Muslims are terrorizing, for example, the Ahmadis, who are Muslims who are considered heretical by the mainstream Sunnis. And so this is the same story, really, that's happening all over the world right now. It's a resurgence of a hardline brand of Islam that is terrifying for unbelievers and for women.
Well, I know in Malaysia that there is a large Christian and Buddhist minority. Is the same true in Indonesia?
In Indonesia, it's Christian and Ahmadi Muslim.
I see.
And both of them are seriously more threatened than they were just a few years ago.
All right. There was a case, and it was a few years ago, of some Christian schoolgirls who were beheaded by an Islamic gang in Indonesia. And that must be going back now between, 5 and 8 years, I would think.
Yeah, that's right. It was about 2005, I believe. And they were just walking to school, 12-year-old schoolgirls, and they were attacked and beheaded by Islamic jihadis, who are really the ones in the driver's seat in Indonesia now, the same kind of factions, the same groups with the same hostility toward anything non-Muslim.
Extraordinary. Is there any fight back, any response? I assume, well, maybe I'm being too optimistic here. I assume there was a larger, moderate Muslim group within this part of the world.
Well, there has been. In Indonesia, as in many parts of Africa and Central Asia, especially in the former Soviet republics, there has prevailed for many decades a kind of cultural Islam that de-emphasizes jihad, de-emphasizes belligerence and hatred of non-Muslims, and affects a kind of a cultural accommodation with non-Muslim groups. But this was not really something based on Islamic texts and teachings, certainly not anything based on the Quran or Muhammad. And so it's fallen by the wayside as groups out of Saudi Arabia, groups out of Iran, groups from Pakistan also are traveling around the Islamic world and trying to reawaken people to what they portray as the true version of Islam and call them back to what they call forgotten obligations. As a matter of fact, that is the name of one of the most popular of these publications from these kinds of groups, Jihad, the Forgotten Obligation. And so they are actually directly attacking the cultural Islam that is a little less virulent, violent, and vehement, and are instead trying to replace it with this hardline version.
That's a phrase I wasn't familiar with, forgotten obligation. That's, I think, an important one to remember. Less severe, but still worrying. There was a case recently, I think just this week or last week, of a group of kids, teenagers, punks, I suppose, or the Indonesian version of, and they were arrested by the cops, and they had their heads were shaved, and they were beaten. Now, this is social engineering of an unacceptable kind. Is it particularly Islamic, though, or just authoritarian?
Well, certainly it's authoritarian, and certainly you'll see the same kind of thing in any authoritarian regime. But in this case, this was something that happened in Indonesia that was very much like what happened recently in Iran. These guys in Indonesia, they were punk rockers, at least by their own self-description. They were wearing mohawk haircuts, and these were considered to be not in conformity with Islamic values. So the terrorizing and brutalization of them took place from strictly an Islamic standpoint. Similarly, in Iran recently, we saw people targeted who were wearing Western dress and wearing rock and roll T-shirts and that kind of thing. And they were attacked by the security forces in Iran. The jerry cans, this cans of water from the latrines that get very filthy in the public restrooms in Iran, they had to drink out of them. It was really a terrible scene, and surprising to see the same kind of thing happening in Indonesia, which is so famous for its moderation.
But it's particularly ironic, of course, because Iran has this wonderful Persian culture and the country's being Arabized, and Indonesia is not obviously Arabic at all. And if you travel, I'm sure you have it in the Middle East, you'll hear quite a lot of racism from Arab Muslims about non-Arab Muslims, including Iranians, but particularly Indonesians and Malaysians.
Oh, very much so, Michael. And this is one of the hidden things about Islam that nobody talks about and is very seldom acknowledged. And that is that Islam is very much a vehicle for Arab supremacism. Obviously, it's an Arabic religion. Converts to Islam adopt Arabic names. Arabic culture and language are celebrated in a way that non-Arabic culture and language are not. The Quran, of course, is in Arabic. You have to pray in Arabic no matter what your nationality. You cannot pray or read the Quran unless it's in Arabic. And this has always, throughout Islamic history, engendered a kind of supremacism among Arabs, and they have lorded it over non-Arab Muslims. We see this breaking out in violence at various points in Islamic history, and we see it today. As a matter of fact, the Muslims in Darfur, where a very famous genocide has been going on for years in the Sudan, that is taking place largely because the non-Arab Muslims are being targeted by the Arabs for being not Islamic enough, which in their view means not Arabic enough. And yes, we're seeing the same thing happening in Iran, which has essentially thrown away its grand Persian culture for many centuries because of the Islamic denigration for anything that is non-Islamic or pre-Islamic. And also now in Indonesia as well. Even in Indonesia, it's kind of a funny thing. I remember seeing a photograph of Southeast Asian economic ministers at a financial summit a few years back. And all of them had various kinds of Chinese or other kinds of Southeast Asian names. And then in the middle of them was Abdullah Ibrahim, who was the minister from Indonesia. Yeah. And I thought, this is so completely and glaringly non-indigenous to the Indonesians to have this man have an Arabic name. But that is something that comes with Islam.
Robert, as ever, a great pleasure. Have a wonderful and safe Christmas. Thank you, my friend.
You too. Thanks, Michael.